Hello, everybody. Welcome to History Valley Podcast. Today, I am moderating a debate between Dr. James David Audlin and Dr. Dennis R. McDonald. And today, they're going to be debating: did Joseph Arimathea, Judas Iscariot, and Mary Magdalene exist? James Audlin takes the position that they did exist, while Dennis McDonald thinks they did not. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. So, that being said, I give the first 10 minutes to Dr. McDonald to make his introductory argument, and we'll go from there. Dennis?
Okay, Jacob, I don't know that I need 10 minutes to give my argument, and I'll cede the rest of the time to James with the possibility that I can claim a few minutes at the end to counter him. My interest in the topic, that is, did Judas Iscariot, Mary Magdalene, and Joseph of Arimathea exist, is related to a larger project of understanding the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles as imitations of Greek poetry. And I know that is a minority viewpoint in the field, but part of what drives that is the use of significant names that is characteristic of much of Greek poetry and prose compositions in the Roman Empire. And all three of the characters we're talking about have names that are suspicious. No one before Judas Iscariot was ever called Iscariot. His father is called Iscariot in the Gospel of John, but that too is probably coming from the synoptic account. So Mark is the earliest example we have of that name. And in my opinion, and I think this is correct, every use of that name thereafter is derivative of it. No one in antiquity was called the Magdalene or a Magdalene except for Mary Magdalene. So why is it that we have this this neologism again for a name in the Passion narrative? The name Magdal in Aramaic, as James no doubt knows better than I, means tower. And the character in the Iliad that most resembles Mary Magdalene is Andromache, who watches her husband Hector being dragged behind the chariot of Hector from a tower at Portus. By the way, Iscariot, Judas Iscariot, has an analogy in the Odyssey in Melanthius, also has a significant name. His name means black, and he's a slave. A very interesting note about black slavery in antiquity. But Melanthius is a victim. He is in danger of exposing Odysseus to the suitors and is a part of the plot to kill Telemachus. No place on a map is called Arimathea. In Greek, Ari means excellent, and Mathea means education or discipleship. He's Mr. Excellent Discipleship. If the tradition of Jesus's father as Joseph is significant, then Joseph of Arimathea is a counter to Joseph of Nazareth, who should have been the one to bury his son, but in fact it's Joseph of Excellent Discipleship who does so. There is no place on a map or in ancient literature called Arimathea, and so even though you'll find it in the Bible atlases, it really doesn't exist. Now, why is it that we have these significant names? Well, we have other significant names that are attached to the Passion narrative. For example, Simon of Cyrene is carrying Jesus's cross when it was Simon Peter who had agreed to carry the cross. James and John asked to sit at Jesus's right and left hand, but it's in fact two criminals that sit on Jesus's right and left at the cross. There are other significant names in the Gospel of Mark, and they're all over the place in the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. Eutychus means lucky, for example. Skivas means left-handed or lefty. So this makes me suspicious that these significant names flag characters that Mark needed in order to drive his narrative. So I think that's basically it. We don't have any external evidence that's not related somehow directly or indirectly to the Gospel of Mark for these characters. Their names are significant and they play roles that are significant either in the Iliad or in the Odyssey. And I could give other examples as well. So I'll be interested in knowing what James makes of that, and maybe I can respond to him after his 10 minutes.
Okay. James, you're up.
Sure. Yeah. No. I thank you, Dennis. Wonderful precision in your presentation. My perspective begins, as I think some viewers who've previously watched this program know, my specialty is not just with Greek, but especially with Aramaic, the Galilean Aramaic dialect that Jesus and his contemporaries spoke. So I look at the names not so much from a Greek perspective, but an Aramaic. Of course, I'm aware of the Greek perspective, but they are originally Aramaic names. So while I do agree with Dennis that there is a great amount of implication, paraphrase, even at times quotation from various classical literatures, including Homer, I found myself in the Gospels, especially in John, references not only to the Iliad, but also the Odyssey. There's quite a few that I have detected from Sappho, one or two even from Virgil, who's a Latin author. So I do agree with Dennis that there is a great deal of interplay between the classical literature and the Gospels. I do not, however, believe these are fictional characters or that they may be. One important factor for me is that, of course, in the early centuries, there were a number of critics of what we now call Christianity. And none of these ever raise the suggestion that this is all fiction, that this is all made up. Celsus, for example, an early pagan author, Hellenistic author who wrote a book called The Veritable Truth, he takes it for granted that these are real people, but he questions their integrity, their honesty, and so on and so forth. Now, to get at the cognomens that Dennis was speaking about a little bit, Iscariot, yes, Iscariotes in Greek, but I take it back into the Galilean Aramaic, in which it is either Ishkariot, which means Ish, a human being, Kariot, from the village of Kariot, which is today in more or less Samaria, more or less in the West Bank area. This would be northwest of Jerusalem. And that coheres with where the family of Judas comes from. Judah is his name in Aramaic, referring to the name of the country, of course. And so the connections in that area, Judas Iscariot, as we pronounce it in English, is, yes, known as the son of Simon Iscariot, as we know him in English, Simon the leper, Sarat. Ishkariot, Sarat can also mean the man with leprosy. And Aramaic, by the way, loves these double entendre, loves to have a single word that means more than one thing. And I think that is probably the case with the word we pronounce Iscariot, such that it's referring to the town of Kariot and at the same time to Simon's leprosy, the father. Simon the leper is mentioned, as Dennis mentioned, in the Gospel of John as the father of Judah. So I consider him to be a real character. Mary Magdalene, it's Magdalena in Greek. However, in Aramaic, it's Magdalita. I am not among those who say that it refers to tower, however. Migdol is actually another word. It's similar. The consonants are the same, but the vocalization is different. So I don't believe Mary Magdalene, her name was Mary the Tower or anything like that. Nor do I believe the other popular conclusion that many people hold, that it means Mary from Magdala. Magdala was, it starts with T, Tyrrheneus, something like that, Tyrrheneus. It was not called Magdala in the first century in her lifetime. That didn't come about for about 2 or 3 centuries thereafter. So it's not likely that she was called Mary from Magdala. The name Magdalita, however, does refer to braided hair. And that's very interesting, braided or plaited hair. You can say it either way. Jesus, there's a certain amount of evidence in the early texts that I've found. Jesus and also Mary had taken the vows of the Notzrim, or in English, Nazarites. You can read about this in the book of Numbers, chapter 6, that they had taken this vow. People who had taken the vow of the Notzrim, amongst other things, did not cut their hair. What they did instead was to braid their hair and then wrap it around the head in the form of a crown. And that crown, the word for crown in Aramaic is nazar. And nazar is the root of the word notzrim, that's a plural, the people who have taken the vow of the nazar, the vow of the crown, you could say. So Magdalita refers to a woman who has braided or plaited her hair in this manner and wrapped it around her head in the shape of a crown. That's how I understand her name. Arimathea, Dennis is absolutely right with how it's pronounced in Greek, of course, but it comes from Aramaic and Hebrew as well. Har Ramathaim. Har means a mountain, and Ramathaim refers to the area of Ramath, as it's pronounced in English. Some of you might remember in the Genesis when Rachel is mourning her children in the land of Ramath. That's Har Ramathaim, and that got garbled into Greek as Arimathea. And so it has a good, noble heritage. It's pretty standard. You read such names in the Talmud rather often, as well as in the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh. So I don't see anything terribly unusual about these names that they would have to come from a Greek tradition. Rather, I see these as names, expectable names. Cognomens were used. For those who are not familiar with the fact, surnames, last names like James David Audlin or Dennis MacDonald or Jacob Berman, such surnames were not used in the early times. So to distinguish you from the other Judah, the other Mary, the other Yeshua, Jesus, you got a cognomen. You were Jesus from this town, or you were Jesus who is known for some characteristic or some deed he did. So these names to me are normal, expected. Where I agree with Dennis is that, yes, there is a certain amount of reflection of the classical literature in the Gospels that we are familiar with, as well as the non-canonical Gospels. But I don't see that as so pervasive a force in the Gospels that we have to conclude that these people are fictional and based on allusions to Homeric epics and others. That should do it for now.
Okay. Can I respond, Jacob? Or
Yeah,
do you want to
go
ask a
ahead.
question?
Please.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I respect your philology, James, but I find several problems with it. One thing we haven't talked about is why it is the case that in the case of all three of these characters, we don't have certain external verification that they existed. You know, so everything is related to the Gospel of Mark, in my view. Now, some people have disputed that, but I think the only evidence we have is coming from Mark. Now, if you're right about these names, those cognomens would mean nothing to Mark's reader. I would wonder why they're even there. By the way, let's get to the philology, though. It is my understanding that there is no example of anybody having a cognomen with the beginning ish and a local name after it. I agree with you, karioth. means village, and there is a Cario that goes by that name. I agree with that. But as far as I know, there's no one else who's ever been called Ish, and then the name of a city. Now, in my view, it's coming from the Greek is, into, and it's into the city, and it's a flag to Melanthius, who drives goats into the city to help the suitors. So that would be one challenge I would have. I'm okay if, in fact, the city of Magdala was not named Magdala until after Mary Magdalene, even by centuries. It is the case, though, that the triliteral Magdal means a tower. And Mark, in other cases, using Aramaic, is not so good about preserving the vowels, but better the consonants of Aramaic words. You've seen that too.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So that I would say, instead of saying Mary of Tower Town, maybe I should say Mary and the Tower, Mary of Tower. That still would identify her with Andromache, in my view, which would make both of those names significant. Now, you're right about Arimathea, meaning presumably Har plus a land reference.
Ramathea.
I mean, that makes sense. That makes sense. And you have something similar to it actually in Josephus. In two different words, as I recall, you have Har something or other, and we don't have other evidence for it. So, and I'm not going to question whether those are real place references, but the advantage of having Arimathea, excellent discipleship, is that Joseph is doing what a disciple should have, what his father should have, that is, seeing to the burial of his son. So those are some of the philology points. I think you're right that people who objected to the Christian stories, who knew them, and I would include, in addition to Celsus, Porphyry and Lucian, did not pick up on whether these characters were manufactured, but they do think at least in the case of Porphyry, that some of the stories are manufactured. So, but you're right that they did not object to these names as not being characters. So my biggest issue, and by the way, I really do not have a theological or a professional stake in this discussion. So I'm interested in the discussion, and I don't consider it a debate. I consider it two scholars talking together about philology. And at a number of points, we do agree. And I respect your scholarship and wouldn't want to challenge it. But so those are some of the things that I would say. So for me, the bigger issue is, why don't we have confirming evidence that they existed? That's a pretty standard historical measure that we use. The other is that I think these names are not just throwaways that identify an individual who lived, but that they might have some significance to the reader. So in the one case, it would be into the city, Melanthius, and that's Judas. Another is a woman who's related to a Magdal or a Migdal. You're right about the vowel flexibility in these triliterals. And also Arimathea as excellent discipleship. Even if there were a Har Armadine, a Greek would pick it up. And by the way, Matthew plays on that word, because Joseph, he has been become a disciple, Mathatisthe, I think it's something like that. So those would be my responses. If they existed, that's fine with me. But I just find that the historical evidence is thin, and that the philology is really quite fascinating. By the way, we could also talk about other Aramaic play in the Gospel of Mark. I think Dalmanutha comes from the Greek word limen, and it means of the harbor. with the article a at the end, and you have uth as a place name ending, and so on. Another would be Boanerges, the sons of thunder. And on that one, clearly Mark doesn't know Aramaic very well, or we still don't know how that all fits together. So I would identify also Bar Timaeus to be a significant name, potentially the son of Timaeus, the honored one, and things like that. So I think what our viewers are getting a good taste of, James, and I would hope this is the case, is that the philology that goes into studying Greek and Aramaic is worthwhile, and that it also is difficult. And people can't just go around and say, I think so-and-so existed or didn't exist. There are arguments to be made to understand these texts, and they're marvelous texts. And I can tell you enjoy working in them as much as I do. So that would be my response, I guess.
Wonderful, delightful. First of all, Dennis, obviously I couldn't agree with you more. There's absolutely no debate here. I am enjoying immensely hearing your perspective. I often told my students that I learn far more from people who disagree with me than those who say, yeah, you're right. Those who tell me, yeah, you're right, I haven't learned anything. But I learned from perspective. If everything were colored blue, we never would see the color blue. We have to see red and orange, yellow, green to be able to see blue. And that's what you are providing, and I appreciate that.
And I appreciate what you did too. This is deep in the weeds of philology, but that's where a lot of the
energy.
But it's
so much fun.
Yeah, I agree with you.
My poor wife, I'm reading something in Aramaic, and I go running up to her and I say, "You can't believe what I found this time." She goes, "What is it this time?"
Yeah, right.
But we survived.
You may be married. You may be married to the same woman I am, because I get some of the same material. Yeah,
if she speaks Spanish, she's the same woman.
Jacob, do you want to jump in here or ask a question of us, or what's going on?
I was going to make a few comments in reply to your few comments.
I'm sorry. No.
If I may.
No.
If you do, Jacob, that's fine. It's just, you also mentioned in passing, Dennis, and I think it's a very important point that we should make for those who are curious and interested about what we do for a living, not that it makes much of a living. And that is the point you made about objectivity, putting aside whatever our personal beliefs may be, whether we're of this or that religious movement or no religious movement, if we're atheist or agnostic, putting that aside. There's a great deal of dogma out there in all parts of the religious scenario of the world. And we need, as scholars, always to put that aside, look at the text itself, what it's saying directly to us, and not allowing the lenses to distort our perspective on that text. I get frustrated, Dennis, because so often I'm reading a commentary or a translation by some of the most well-known, well-respected scholars, and I can't believe the clumsy translations, often obviously overtly distorted translations that I run into. I'm not going to name the names here, but some of our readers listeners would recognize these names immediately, and shame on them for not doing the work more carefully and keeping those dogmatic viewpoints out. So I appreciate that very much, Dennis, what you said.
Thank you, James.
You also spoke to Mark primacy. I am not of that perspective myself, or not quite. Jacob, do you have handy there the scribbly graphic that I made?
Yes, I do.
One that's in my hand right there. No, the other one. The one that I there we go. Okay. So for those who can see that on your screen now, Thomas I date as an extremely early text. I've been working with a French scholar on a recently discovered manuscript that does appear to actually be by Pontius Pilate, not one of a group that were developed in the Middle Ages and ascribed to him. And he puts the date of Thomas in his manuscript as before the year 37, which is quite early. We also have a fragmentary Gospel of Peter. And according to a letter, written by Clement of Alexandria, found by Morton Smith, and I hope we can avoid all the controversy that amounts to nothing when you analyze it about Morton Smith's discovery. Mark wrote a first draft of his gospel based on the oral recollections of Peter in Rome in the probably in the 40s, 50s, in that area. And then later, after Peter's execution, he inherited the written text of a gospel by Peter, of which we have some fragments still today. And probably also elements of Thomas were then incorporated into a second draft of his Gospel of Mark, which was the basis for the canonical Gospel of Mark that we have today, although there are some further changes in that that were made dogmatically by scribes later to make it fit with the dogma that was developing in the Western religion. And then there was, according to Clement of Alexandria, a third Gospel of Mark developed before Mark himself was executed in Alexandria. And that was based on his notes that he made after meeting with John the Presbyter in Ephesus and taking a look at the drafts for the Gospel of John that the presbyter had developed beginning in 42. And those he incorporated as well into what was called by Morton Smith the secret Gospel of Mark. But that's kind of sounds like something that should be on the History Channel. The secret Gospel of Mark is just basically a third draft of Mark after the canonical version. This secret Gospel of Mark version seems to have been the main Markan source for both Matthew and Luke. The reason I say that, and examples could be given, is that when Matthew and Luke paraphrase Mark, it's usually almost always richer, more eloquent than what we have in the actual canonical Mark. So I believe that it came from secret Gospel of Mark, and especially Matthew. The resurrection scenes seem to be almost entirely from secret Gospel of Mark, because of course second Mark, the canonical Mark, lost those. First John, that's my way of saying the Galilean drafts that were very late in time, around the 90s, recovered. Marcion brought them back to Ephesus, and they were completed by Papias of Hierapolis and translated into Greek. And Philip, the Gospel of Philip, is basically a commentary upon those, which helps us with the dating. So then Matthew and Luke, as I mentioned, coming out of those, and Marcion. So my point here only is that, to the contrary of Dennis, I don't see Mark as the first gospel. That is the more common perspective amongst scholars. But I am one who sees Mark as slightly later in time than the early drafts of John, and around the same time as Peter and Thomas. Then, as you also mentioned, Dennis, the question of why isn't there more attestation, more secular evidence to the existence of these people? Jacob, do you have handy the other graphic, the one that is nicely printed and people won't have to strain their eyes to read? Thank you. This is snatched from the General Introduction to the Bible by Geisler and Nix, but I've added a couple of items to it. What we have here, this is obviously a little oversimplified, but what we have here is a list of secular scholars, that is to say non-Christian scholars, who mention Jesus or something about the early religion within the first century and a half after his lifetime. And as you can see, there's a number of these. Without going into details on all of these, this is actually more attestation than we have for a number of well-accepted individuals such as Plato or Aristotle, Homer, Sappho, others as well. We have more attestation. We have more early manuscripts that reflect upon the existence of these people and quote, paraphrase, comment upon the early Christian texts than pretty much any other classical figures. So, with all respect to Dennis, to the contrary of what he said, I think there is a certain amount of good evidence to support the belief that they were real people. So just a few comments in response to your comments, Dennis.
Okay, I guess it's my turn.
Yeah.
There are a few places on your chart that I would agree with. And just so that your auditors know where we stand and we agree on a few things against other people. For example, you consider Marcion's gospel to be a later redaction of the canonical gospel of Luke. I agree with that.
Yep.
You don't make place for Q, and instead of Q, you still have an M and an L.
Yes.
So
Q, I believe, to be largely comprising the secret gospel of Mark. There's other elements in there too, but I was trying to keep the chart simple.
Okay, well, I don't believe the secret gospel of Mark, but you do have Mark in priority in a way. But it may not be the canonical Mark that is in agreement.
Yep.
That's about the only place I agree with your chart. So I don't know if this is the time to get into a debate on the synoptic problem. I'm doing a 600-page synopsis of the Gospels, and I think I can make it pretty clear that John knows the synoptics. Papias doesn't know John or Luke. And that Thomas must be derivative on on Mark and other Gospels. Anyway, so I don't want to get into the synoptic problem unless I'm pressed to. The other chart that you gave us came up too small for me to see, but two things. One is I didn't see on the chart any names of people that we've been talking about. So I didn't see that there were names of Judas or Mary or Joseph of Arimathea. Maybe they were there. But if they are there, the reason that they are there is because people are reading this literature, and the literature itself has taken shape, and people are not, later readers, even pagan readers, are not in a position to question the information they have. They just don't like the theology or the groups that are using it, and so on. Mm-hmm. So I think the takeaway, James, might be this, and I think you'd agree with this. That is, one's assessment of particular issues, such as these names, is related to a more global understanding of synoptic intertextuality or gospel intertextuality, so that one process informs the other. And if you have a model such as you do about the growth of the Gospels, then you're going to have one proclivity to try to place some of these names really quite early in an Aramaic environment. I have a different model, and therefore that's going to inform some of my judgment about these names. Now, unfortunately, we both think the synoptic problem has not yet been solved by others. My position is I don't think you've solved it either, and I think I have. So, that's, and you probably could say the same thing about me. But the takeaway is that the intertextuality of these wonderful texts is vexing. And one of the challenges is to take the various pieces of the puzzle and to try to fit them together into the best picture that we can. But we don't have the box of that the puzzle came in where we can see what the image is and we don't know what the border is. So all we have is a pile of pieces, and we know we don't have all the pieces. So then we're trying to fit these things together. From my perspective, the influence of classical Greek poetry, especially Homer, but also Euripides and other authors, allows us to see some of the picture that we would otherwise not be able to see. So that would be one place, I suppose, that we would weigh differently on these questions.
No, I actually agree largely with what you just said. I too, as I think I might have mentioned earlier, I too find allusions, quotations, paraphrases of Homer. I should have mentioned Euripides previously, Sappho, and I think I said Virgil as well, in these texts. But of course, if it seems to you, Dennis, to work in one direction, and it seems to work to me in the other direction, that is to say, did the classical texts get developed into these gospels as fictions based upon them, or were the gospels accounts of real living human beings that appealed to familiar motifs, familiar ways of expression that we find in these classical literatures, which is more what I say. So it could be in one direction or the other, but I think we both agree that there is an interpenetration. There is clearly some kind of relationship between these classical texts that we're mentioning and the Gospels.
Yeah,
It's just a question of which it is. And as you said, we don't have the box, we don't have the instructions, so we can't be sure.
Just two comments. One is a request. If you could send me a list of, let's say, the 4 or 5 allusions or imitations that you find most striking, I'd really appreciate that.
I'm not quite sure what you're asking for. The allusions that I find to classical writers?
Yes, especially classical poetry.
Oh, heavens to Betsy, there's bunches.
Well, no, if anything you could send me, I'd appreciate it. I just know that there's more out there than I can find, and I'd like to crowdsource this to some extent, and you're one that could do that. But the other thing...
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. What I can do, Dennis, if this is helpful, what I do, because the book is approaching 5,000 words even as we speak. My publisher hates my guts. And so what I can do is I can send you a link to the cloud that the publisher allows me to send to fellow scholars, because this works as a kind of a peer review kind of thing. You have access, therefore, to the book as it stands. It's now in the final edits for the 3rd and final edition. And I can send that to you. You have the whole shebang, or it'll take a few hours. I can try to find all the allusions, but
you can send me the other.
Yeah, because all you have to do is look in the index, and you'll be there. So that might be the most fun.
Okay, you had you put your fingers together like this, and I want to just relate to that image. In trying to put the picture of the puzzle together, what I think is going to be really crucial is for everyone to be clear about the criteria that we're going to use to make the judgments about what is more primitive and what is later. Another is how we would glue pieces together, which ones are clearer and which ones are less so. And I know you do this intuitively, but I mean, I can see that because you have that chart out, you've been playing with those kinds of things. But the more we can articulate it as criteria and then test the criteria the same way a scientist would in trying to test a theorem, or a hypothesis, the better. So I don't know if you've articulated what criteria you used for that synoptic problem, but I think that's something that another place where scholars at a more esoteric level can talk about whether those criteria matter.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do in the book. The trouble with writing about the Gospel of John is, as you know, Dennis, the strings head out to all these other texts, all these other issues, and that's why the book has grown so large, and everybody hates my guts for that.
You know, I've got a 600-page book that I have to work on myself. I publish myself because it's such a nuisance. Yeah.
Yeah. I wish it were 600 pages, but 5,000 pages is just ridiculous. But the reason for that, this is not quite getting to what you were talking about, but the reason for that is because my approach is quite different from the standard beliefs of the mainstream of scholarship. So I have to go extremely carefully explaining Galilean Aramaic. There's, as I said, less than a handful of us in the world are really familiar with that dialect. And I have to go very carefully explaining why I'm tearing down what is pretty much the accepted perspective of most scholars, and then very carefully erect a new edifice in its place, explaining as I go, going bit by bit and by bit, so I can hopefully bring the reader along and not have the reader go in anguish and leave. So that is why it gets to be such a length. I wish
no. Okay. All right. Jacob, I think it's your turn.
Poor guy.
Well, I don't really have much to say. I'm just moderating and watching you two have a discourse one another. Um, I guess what we can do is we can move on to what do you both think about these free characters in general? Like in the sense that James Audlin, do you think that there were some exaggerations to these characters? Dennis, do you think it's possible that they existed and they were heavily exaggerated? I guess we can go into that topic on that side.
Who's going first?
Well, I guess I'll jump in and give you a target to shoot at, James.
No, not at all. Not at all.
In my view, the author of the Gospel of Mark likely is aware of some of Paul's epistles. And in 1 Corinthians 11, there's a passage very well known in Paul. On the night that Jesus was delivered over, he took bread. The word to be delivered over is the same word that is often translated was betrayed. There's no name attached to the betrayer, and we don't know that it was one of the 12. Some people have said it's God. And it could be some person who wasn't in the inside circle of Jesus. Mark could have read that. And by the way, his words of institution in chapter 14 is very close to what we find in 1 Corinthians 11, really remarkably close. And so he could have wanted to fill in the story by identifying who the betrayer was and then putting a somewhat different spin on the Last Supper. So in that case, I think Judas did not exist, but he has a literary antecedent, perhaps in 1 Corinthians 11, in this unknown person who may have betrayed Jesus, according to Paul. Surely, when Jesus was, by the way, I am not a mythicist. Jesus existed, I'm sure of that. But I think he was so popular that a mythology emerged around him that was really very complex and compelling. Now, because he had such admirers, it's sure that some people mourned his death. And curiously, the Gospels are relatively silent about the lamentations that usually accompany the death of a hero by women. And the later tradition fills in that gap rather marvelously by having the three women give their own laments, as in the Gospel of Nicodemus, for example. And the Gospel of John has, with Mary Magdalene, fills in that story a bit more. So these characters did not exist in my view, but they come out of a memory of Jesus's death that surely included lamentations. The traditional lamentations are by women, and Mary Magdalene is an attractive, this isn't sexist, an attractive literary moment, because Jesus's mother is also Mary, and it should be Mary of Nazareth who is mourning her son, but instead it's two other Marys, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph. What about Joseph of Arimathea? Well, Jesus had a father. The tradition says his name was Joseph. In the tradition of burying soldiers, already in Homer, it falls to the father to daringly get the corpse and to bury the son. So already Paul knows, and this is again 1 Corinthians 11, that Jesus died and was buried. Well, who the hell buried him? Somebody buried him. And this is Mark's opportunity to say it's not his own father who buried him, but it's Joseph of excellent discipleship who buried him. So I think you can have rich mythological or fictional histories that are around characters who did not exist. And so I don't think these rich histories mean the character existed, but I think it means that Mark's crafting of these characters was remarkable and issued in lots of imitations and expansions.
Yeah. A point of contact between what you just shared so eloquently and my own perspective is this, that absolutely we find in the classical period, particularly as well as modern times, a kind of a legendary aura that circles around personages, whether they are fictional or historical. Sherlock Holmes, Superman, Tarzan of the Apes, although they are fictional characters, nevertheless, after the death of their original authors, Conan Doyle or who did I mention? Edgar Rice Burroughs, we find people still today writing more stories about them. They continue to accrue. And the same thing, of course, is true for historical persons. That's just as true in classical times.
Alexander the Great. Right.
Yeah, Big L, as I like to call them. Yeah, absolutely. There's so many stories about these people, and some of them, even with characters such as Jesus, we still find some new ones being developed in modern times. We have to look no further than what's his name, the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown and his Band of Renown. That's all we need to think of to illustrate that, or Jesus Christ Superstar, for example. So that process is still continuing.
Right.
Of course, I mention these in passing sometimes in my book, but my concentration is in the early history of what we now know as Christianity. And I'm sure you're aware, Dennis, something of a great deal of that history as I am, that my way of putting it is that there were two essential movements of followers of Jesus's teachings. One of them centered around the teachings of Paul, whom you mentioned very well. And Paul was mainly, especially after his early days after the conversion, he went more to the Gentiles, more to the Greek-speaking, even the Latin-speaking parts of the Roman Empire, rather than to what became the Jewish community. And so his teachings are different for that reason. He also wrote primarily in Greek as opposed to Aramaic, as some of these other authors we're discussing. And we also have to remember that Paul, as far as we know, never even laid eyes on Jesus once. And his packaging, you might say, to use a modern term, his packaging of Jesus was to the contrary of the apostles who actually knew Jesus, and they oftentimes upbraided him for that. So there was kind of a split there. The other community, the more what we could call Jewish community, in my writings, I refer to them as the apostolic community, had a quite different perspective on Jesus. They saw him not so much as kind of in the Roman sense, incarnate deity, like you mentioned Alexander, Augustus would be another. These human beings who achieve greatness. Some of our viewers may recall in I, Claudius, the great BBC program, when the general comes in and announces, the emperor has undergone a metamorphosis. He has now become a god. However, he has condescended to remain in human form for the time being. That kind of perspective we find more in the Pauline than in the Johannine, where Jesus is more of a human being who is chosen, who is selected by God to serve as a mouthpiece, a prophete malak, as an exponent of God's teachings. So that's the point of contact that we have in common. For the apostolics, then, Jesus was strictly a human being, son of God, but then in the Jewish perspective that we find, for example, in the prologue to the Gospel of John, we are all the children of God, and Jesus saw himself as such. The Aramaic texts that I read portray Jesus and Mary, the younger Mary, not the mother, as husband and wife. This is, of course, something that's become rather a matter of notoriety thanks to Dan Brown, but and many mainstream scholars, as a result of Dan Brown, want to stay with the 11-foot pole way away from that. I don't care anymore what happens to my reputation. I'm old enough to not worry. And so I state bluntly, I take these texts seriously. These are earlier texts in the Galilean Aramaic. They portray the two as married. Her name was in Aramaic not Miriam, the name of Jesus' mother, but Marie. And Marie, she's the first person that I can find in the Asamani and other works that document the use of names. She is the first Marie in the region of Palestine, and it was before that all women who had such a name was Miriam, which is a Hebrew Aramaic name. But Marie comes actually from northeastern Africa, from the Tamazight language, and that she was the first to bear that name, and that's why now Mary is such a popular name in the West. So they're very different stories told by these two very different communities of Jesus followers who were quite opposed to each other. We all know who won the battle, because the Christian religion is essentially descended from the Pauline tradition. You also mentioned Joseph of Arimathea, and you were quite right what you said as far as Har Ramachaim, which is the Hebrew and Aramaic root for the Greek name Arimathea. One point where I'm also way out on the end of the branch is that I believe him to be the same individual as Joseph Caiaphas. There's a number of early documents that suggest that to me, and that helps me, I think, to make a great deal of sense out of the texts. The crucifixion of Jesus did not take place in an area that was standard for Roman Roman crucifixions at the time, but was actually in a place that was quite significant in Jewish history. When the Babylonian invasion was about to happen, not long after the reign of Josiah, the holy articles inside the temple were hidden inside a cave somewhere to the north of the Temple Mount. And that area is quite significant. Within the second temple, when it was rebuilt, there was no Ark of the Covenant. So the high priest, when he entered on Yom Kippur, and we're just about there right now, when he entered on Yom Kippur, he would bow and make the splashing of the blood where the Ark of the Covenant used to be, facing north in the Holy of Holies, but that also happens to be facing north toward the cave where supposedly that was hidden. So if that is Caiaphas, Joseph Caiaphas doing that, he, as high priest, had a tomb that was a little further north of this area. So the area is quite significant. It was chosen quite intentionally for the symbolism that accrued around that hill. Pathetically, the area itself is now is right next to a bus station just north. I have to think northeast of the Damascus Gate. So I believe that the two people, Joseph of Arimathea and Caiaphas, one person.
Okay.
I lost the track of where I was going to go, but you could go ahead, Dennis.
I find that to be a house of cards, James. And so, but I do have a technical question to ask you about it. When you attempt to get to the Galilean dialect of Aramaic, did you use Syriac much as a way of giving you a sense of the Aramaic, or did you ignore the Peshitta and other Syriac?
Oh yeah, no, I started out with Syriac when I first.
I did. Yeah, I did that. I did that for about several months at one point, in large measure just to work on my Syriac. But of course, you don't have Syriac for all the text that you're looking at. You have it for the biblical text and so on. But just so your readers know, that's the way to go. If you're trying to reconstruct what Aramaic looked like, if there was Aramaic behind the Gospels, the Peshitta is probably going to be one of your most important ways to get there.
That's where you're going to start.
Yeah. So, and so I certainly understand that. I found that for myself to be a dead end, though it certainly helped my Syriac. And I then found the Syriac to be more helpful in reconstructing texts of apocryphal Acts of Apostles, say the Acts of Thomas, and so on, which you're familiar with. Sure. But this is probably not the time to get any further into the philology and the problems. But I do admire the project going back from the Greek, from looking at the Syriac, comparing it with the various textual critics, textual apparatus we have in Greek and in other languages, and then try to explore, what an Aramaic background might have looked like, is a daunting task. Yeah. And so I respect that project. It didn't lead to the places that I had hoped that it would for myself, but that's the way to do it.
Yeah, just for those just tuning in, the Peshitta refers to the standard text of the Gospels as well as other works as well in Aramaic. It's equivalent to what is generally called the Textus Receptus, the standardized text in Greek.
Right.
So the Peshitta, as you know, Dennis, largely, not always, of course, but largely means what its meaning is pretty much the same as the Greek. It's pretty uncommon that the Peshitta and the Textus Receptus in Greek have a quite different view.
Do you use Heracleon more?
Yeah, less often than the Peshitta. I do. Obviously, I look at the Peshitta. I go to the CAL, the Comprehensive Aramaic Lexicon, all the time. They're probably going to start charging me rent. I'm there so often. But yes, for anybody who wants to look at Aramaic, that's the start. The problem is that the Syriac dialect, which did not catch on until 3 or 4 centuries after the life of Jesus, it wasn't even in existence until much later. The problem with Syriac, and also a related problem, and that is the vocalization, what's called Masoretic pointing in Hebrew, and the equivalent Aramaic pointing, those were added in the Middle Ages. So a lot of scholars, for example, when I talk with someone like Simon Brock, who is a renowned Syriac scholar, and I say, I'm looking at this word X, and for me, it can mean ding, 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 ding. And Simon Brock will say in response, no, it only means this one thing. And that's because Simon is looking at the text with the vocalization marks, such that, yes, it means one and only one thing. But when it's written with just the consonants, Aramaic is an amazing language. It's a poet's delight, but it's a translator's nightmare, because the same word, that is the same set of consonants, can mean bunches of different things: verbs, nouns, adjectives.
Are you familiar with Stan Jones and what Stan does? Yeah, he's a good friend of mine. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, cool. Yeah,
out here in California.
Yeah. There's a growing number of people who are interested in the Aramaic, but still, unfortunately, they largely stay with the Syriac. I happened upon about 12 years ago. This is what led to this third edition of my book. About 12 years ago, I stumbled upon what Agnes Smith Lewis and her sister, Margaret Dunlap, twin sister, what they discovered around the turn of the 20th century in the St. Catherine Monastery. And that was manuscripts of what they call the Palestinian lectionaries, which are written in Galilean Aramaic. They were wonderful transcribers, but not very good translators. So when Agnes Smith Lewis put together in her publication of this a list of divergences between the lectionary texts and the Peshitta, it was woefully lacking. So people like Brock or Bruce Metzger, when they consider the possibility there's anything interesting in these Galilean texts, they look at her summary, because it saves time, obviously, and they think, oh, there's nothing to it. But when I looked at these with my ability to read the Galilean text, I was astonished. The first half of chapter 9 of the Gospel of John is completely different. The Good Samaritan, the Good Shepherd story is not there. Rather, chapter 10. It's a continuation of the conversation that ends chapter 9 in John. There is just about a chapter's worth of material between John chapter 19 and chapter 20, after the emplacement in the tomb and the morning of the resurrection. An abundance of material that we do not find in any other Aramaic texts, that is to say, Syriac Aramaic texts. So these Galilean texts are of seminal importance. And the more I study them, the more astonished I am. Another vital source is Ephraim the Syrian, and I'm sure you've run into him, Dennis.
Yeah,
Ephraim is simply one of the greatest Christian writers, a brilliant poet, a brilliant theologian. He's still remembered and revered in the East, although they don't read much of his writing. But in the West, he's almost completely forgotten. Scholars know the name, you know the name, but not many people do. Ephraim is simply wonderful. Even if you don't care about theology, just read his poetry. His poetry is beautiful stuff. But here's the thing. Ephraim, living in the 4th century, quotes from the Gospel of John and the other Gospels in a version of the text which no longer exists. These manuscripts are lost. His quotations are somewhat different. For example, Louis Leloir, the French scholar, wonderful scholar, Roman Catholic. He was a monk, lovely man. He put together a superlative book, a wonderful resource in which he amasses all of the variant texts that Ephraim the Syrian has from the Gospels that are different from what we understand to be the standardized text. So what I'm getting at is that these Galilean texts are so different that I consider to be another text type alongside the familiar ones that we know about.
I see. That's important.
Yeah. And they're remarkable because they generally have a text at the end. A colophon is the technical term for these. A colophon in which the scribes say this text is taken directly from the original manuscript of the Gospel of John, which is on display in Ephesus. More or less, that phrase is put as a colophon at the end of these manuscripts. That's the way we can tag these Galilean text type manuscripts. So it's a rich resource, and I'm forever trying to convince anybody. I've got grandchildren here. I'm trying to teach them a little Aramaic, so somebody will keep on with this. There's so much there.
And James, we have a super chat question from the audience to you. Ken Scalita, thank you for your super chat. Question for Dr. Audlin. Why would a historical Joseph of Arimathea go from voting to condemn Jesus to crucifixion to suddenly becoming a Christian and wanting the body literally overnight?
Yeah, wonderful question. The situation is this. Jesus, the death of Jesus has, by the organized religion, been blamed on various individuals and various peoples. It has been sometimes blamed on the Jews. At times, all Jews of all time and place were blamed for the death of Jesus, and that became one of the major forces behind anti-Semitism and the horrible treatment that Jews have received through the Middle Ages in Christian lands, and also, of course, the Holocaust very recently. The reality, Judas has been blamed for Jesus's death. Pilate has been blamed for Jesus' death. The Romans have been blamed for Jesus' death. But the reality is Jesus wanted to die. He did not want to live. These people were who helped make that possible were doing what he wanted. The Gospel of John, when Judas is leaving to make the arrangements for the arrest, Jesus says, go what you need to do. Do it quickly. Tonight is coming. You got to get moving. Jesus is clearly supportive of what Judas is about to do. So Joseph of Arimathea, who as I said, I believe is Joseph Caiaphas, in chapter 11 of the Gospel of John, he's trying to broker an arrangement because he does understand that Jesus wants to die. But the Sanhedrin doesn't want to kill Jesus because they, as well as Pilate, know that could be a powder keg. That could set off an explosion. You have riots in the streets, and then the Romans would have to crack down and destroy the city, as of course they eventually did in the year 70. So he tries to broker an arrangement. That's why Joseph says in that passage, better one man die than the people. So he arranges that. Pilate does his best to try to get Jesus off the hook, but Pilate eventually is persuaded by Jesus that he must die. So he insists, no, we're not going to put, he said he's king of the Jews, but the sign on the cross will say the king of the Jews. He's trying to show respect to this individual. Why? Because that keeps the people from boiling over and exploding. So
can I respond?
I'm sorry?
Oh, wait. Go ahead.
No, just so Caiaphas isn't that he's opposed to Jesus in trying to arrange the death. He's actually supportive of Jesus in doing so. There's Caiaphas and John the Presbyter were the top two in the temple at the time. Caiaphas was the high priest. According to Epictetius and others, John the Presbyter was the Sagan, the number 2 priest in the temple. So they worked very closely. They were friends. They knew Jesus. They supported Jesus in his mission. And while they may not have understood why Jesus insisted on death, nevertheless, they accepted that was what he wanted to do. So there's no disconnect, as the questioner asked, there's no disconnect as far as I can see it between what Caiaphas does in the Gospel of John and Caiaphas or Joseph of Arimathea, whichever you prefer, spending the rest of his life extolling the greatness of Jesus. End of statement.
James, I think that's a total historical fiction. Historical fiction.
I'm not surprised you do that. That's your perspective, and I respect that.
Okay. But I think Ken's question is a good one. And you said it was a good one too. And my answer would simply be that even the Gospels are not consistent in Joseph's motivation. In one case, he's a member of the council that condemned Jesus. In another, he was a closet disciple, and so on. So there's, I think it's Ken, there's a question even inside the gospel tradition about why he seems to have changed horses. Was he clandestine? Was he converted because of the crucifixion and so on? So, but there's nothing, in my view, James, there's nothing historical about what you said. I'll just say it that way.
Yeah, and that's fine. I don't agree, but okay, we can still have a nice beer together.
Yeah, well, where's the beer?
Well, you have to come down here. We have excellent cerveza.
So where do you live?
I'm in Western Panama. I live in a mountain valley, a rural
that's what
valley,
you said before.
lovely village. Yeah. The weather here is beautiful year round. We don't have the heat you people have up north. The food is fresh. The air is clean. The environment is without pollution. There's no crime. And I can hear the planes filling now with people coming down here.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, no, what you said is good, Dennis. As far as I'm concerned, I don't see a disconnect between what Caiaphas does and his being as well as secret disciple. I think that's exactly the point. He understood, being a secret disciple, he understood that Jesus wanted to die, and he wanted to arrange that, but he had to arrange it in such a manner that didn't set off riots in the streets and bring the Romans down to.
Okay, I hear that and don't agree with it.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Would you two like to go ahead and give concluding thoughts to the debate, and then we can end this discussion? Okay. So, Dennis, I'll give you 5 minutes. Give your concluding thoughts, and then James will follow up with his 5 minutes.
I'm not going to need 5 minutes, but
Okay.
I probably
Sure.
will take more than 5 seconds.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about the medium, Jacob and James. I'm not going to talk about the substance so much. There's something about the internet and chats like this and blogs or podcasts that is really quite wonderful. And there's another part of it that is really quite frustrating, actually, several pieces that are frustrating, and I just want to name them. The part that's wonderful is that scholars who, like James and myself, who work steadily in the weeds and are scientists really in the developing of these texts and understanding them, have public exposure. That clearly is the good part. The bad part is that in 45 minutes, we can do little more than dance around and tell people how we differ and how we agree. But the other piece is that we are talking to people who themselves are not experts. And it's too easy for someone to walk away from a podcast like this and to think that now they are experts as well. And they don't need to learn Aramaic, and they don't need to learn Greek and Latin. And their judgment's as good as anybody's because scholars themselves disagree. And I think the disagreement should not end up in cynicism, but in intelligent conversation and moving on. No one was able to discover penicillin by deciding what fruit they wanted to eat for breakfast. It took scientists that had criteria, that did testing, and there's a lot of luck in the discovery of penicillin too. And so the podcast gives the impression that anybody who listens becomes an expert. I think what listening to the podcast should mean is that we're all amateurs. We're all struggling to find out what's going on. That this is not the place for being dogmatic, but for being more vigilant. And I'm sure James and I take energy from podcasts like this to become more vigilant. But I'm concerned that this not be a way of entertaining people and giving them, making them feel confident in their own prejudices, but rather to say that this is an important scientific endeavor. Scholars can disagree with it because in many cases the data is tricky. And so I'm a bit, I really appreciate the podcast, Jacob. I'm not trying to diss on your medium at all, but I think it has limitations. It's not the same as having students who are doctoral students and you can train, for semesters and see a dissertation come out and so on. So there's a bit of voyeurism, if I could put it that way, in such podcasts. And I do appreciate the effort, Jacob, that you put into it. I appreciate having people watch and being interested in these topics. I'm a little concerned that the takeaway for some people is a matter of finding support for their own prejudices instead of getting kicked in the ass to do something better.
Well, that tends to happen often. I look at comments. It's not just on my channel, but other YouTube channels too. And people will argue with each other. There'll be like hundreds of replies to one comment. People arguing to each other for days or weeks or even months. I pick this guy's side, I pick his side, and it's a mess. I understand what you're saying completely.
Yeah, and I 100% agree, Dennis, with what you said. My hope, however, is that if even one or two people listening to this program, listening to this discussion, are inspired by our conversation to look into this, to read your book. And I disagree with a lot of what you say. I agree with a lot of what you say, but I nevertheless enthusiastically encourage people, get Dennis MacDonald's book and read. Get mine, read. I don't care if you agree with me or not. I don't care if you agree with him or not, but read and think. If you and I inspire just a few people listening to this to think and to investigate, to look further, not to take what we say, rather going quickly over a lot of material. There's a reason your book is 600 pages. There's a reason mine is 5,000 pages. It's not easy stuff to deal with. But if a few people are encouraged to get past the easy and get into the difficult, that's where it's fun. You use the image of poking around in the weeds. That's what it is. It's tough work. I get up at 4:30 in the morning. I'm at work on these manuscripts long before the sun appears. And generally 8 or 9 at night, I'm still doing it. My wife thinks I'm nuts, but then I am. But that's the only way to get it done. I'm not getting any younger. You're not getting any younger. We got to get this job done. And we hope and pray somebody listening to a program such as Jacob's will say, my gosh, this is so exciting. I am going to get some basic courses into my belt and how to read Greek, Aramaic, whatever. And I want to investigate into this for myself. I don't think Dennis is right. I don't think James is right. But by gosh, I want to dig into it and see what I think. That's what I hope to inspire, and you hope to inspire somebody today to do.
Thank you, James. Yeah.
And I thank both of you for coming on today. I really enjoyed this discussion. And I would like to get you two back together someday. Maybe we can talk about something else. Maybe the synoptic problem could be something that you two can have a friendly discussion
on.
Or the secret gospel, because we have different views on that.
Yeah.
I actually have an experience with Morton Smith about the secret gospel of Mark. And I had one of his students say that I killed him.
No.
I did have the student say that.
Oh,
and it's because Morton Smith got so angry with me when I gave a review in public of the secret gospel of Mark that he flipped out, and he was dead 2 weeks later of a heart attack. Yeah. So I don't think I killed him, but and then I also was responsible for taking books out of his apartment in New York to distribute them to doctoral students. And that's an interesting story too, what it took to get those books out of that apartment.
Don't feel bad, Dennis. As you know, not you, but a number of scholars, including some big names, were at the time aiming some horrible ad hominem attacks on Martin, who, as far as I'm concerned, was one of the very finest scholars of this in this field in the 20th century. Just a brilliant mind and a good man, a good human being. And these people should be ashamed of themselves for the attacks they made on him. And unfortunately, it happened that your comments were at that time, and obviously he was getting a little sensitive, and I'm sure that's why he reacted the way he did.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I really appreciate it.
Nice to meet you, James.
My pleasure. I hope to talk to you again.
I'm going to play the outro now, and I'll see all you later.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.